A basalt column no wider than a doorway stands in green water 40 feet below the surface, its skin furred with lime, its edges cut too straight for reef stone, its base sunk in a floor of black silt, where the current barely moves. In AD 363, the Synod of Laodicea restricted books outside the approved reading list. Giant texts were pushed out with them. The reason was control. Material linked to pre-flood knowledge was treated as a threat to doctrine. Then, in 1952, when Cave 4 at Qumran was being cleared under collapsing marl and loose chalk, a run of torn Aramaic scraps surfaced beside other Enochic material, and among the damaged lines were references that later copyists tried very hard to flatten into safer language. The discovery mattered because the fragments were not isolated. Related wording turned up in later Manichaean witnesses from Turfan, in catalog notes from European collections, and in unpublished comparison sheets circulated between Jerusalem and Paris in the late 1960s. What looked at first like stray giant material opened into a larger record, a sequence describing 12 submerged pillars, sealed beneath water, associated with objects never meant for ordinary use. The Book of Giants describes 12 submerged pillars, built to hide forbidden relics before the flood, and later divers reached them without understanding what they were for. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what the evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If drowned ruins and forbidden relics fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from records. But here's what makes this stranger. The pillar claim does not come from one loose line and one excited translator. It sits across a cluster of readings that only become visible when you place the Aramaic fragments beside the later Eastern witnesses and read them as engineering language instead of devotional language. Fragment 4Q530, Column 2, lines 8 through 12, in the 1979 Millick working reconstruction, contains the sequence usually softened as supports of the deep. But the noun there is the same load-bearing term used in Second Temple building, accounts for upright shafts cut to carry weight. In the Hebrew University comparison notes prepared for a 1984 seminar on Enochic materials, the phrase is glossed more bluntly, 12 uprights placed below the waters. That number is not isolated. 4Q531 fragment 17 preserves the count again beside a damaged verb for sinking or setting down. Stuckenbrook's 1997 translation preferred established in the abyss, but the Durham margin notes attached to the review copy preserve an alternate reading, fixed under the flooded basin. The contents matter just as much as the structure. In 4Q532 fragment 3, line 6, the text lists vessels, tablets, and the measured things, a phrase several editors treated as ceremonial. That reading does not hold if you follow the same expression into the Turfan parallel, designated M98/12, where the inventory includes marked stones, inscribed metal, and sealed bundles linked to instruction. At the École Biblique, Father Luc Renard's unpublished 2003 lecture summary treated the inventory as technical archive language. He connected it to a set of recurring words for counting, sealing, and preserving. Not worship objects, not burial goods, stored material. Then there is the water itself. A line in 4Q531, fragment 24, refers to the pillars being set, where light breaks weakly. That is not surface language. It suggests depth, filtered visibility, and deliberate placement below normal reach. Marine epigrapher Samira Halevi, writing for a University of Haifa workshop in 2011, argued that the phrase fits shallow submerged architecture on a continental shelf better than riverbed collapse. Her paper also noted that the text distinguishes between stone laid on dry ground before inundation and stone placed after the waters had already covered the lower plain. That distinction is crucial. It means the structure was not simply flooded later, it was designed for a submerged condition. One more detail keeps showing up. In the Geneva facsimile annotations to fragment group B41, dated 2008, the scribal hand marks a phrase usually translated as "watchers over the store." The older Syriac back translation gives a harder sense: guards or observers posted over deposits. That matters, because the passage pairs the guardians with instructions about approach, sealing, and silence. The text is not wandering, it is procedural. The translation history shows the same pattern of narrowing again and again. When J.T. Millick circulated his preliminary reconstructions, several terms were left open in the margins as architectural or topographic. By the time those lines reached more popular summaries, the harder readings had softened into depths, vessels, and mighty things, which sound impressive but explain nothing. In 2001, Professor Rafi Nersesian's review seminar at the Hebrew University compared the surviving Aramaic roots with Nabatean storage terminology and argued that at least 3 disputed words belong to the vocabulary of placement, sealing, and retrieval. A 2014 doctoral appendix from the University of Leiden, rarely cited outside specialist work, went further and mapped the recurrence of those terms across the Qumran fragments and the Turfan witnesses. The overlap was too dense to dismiss. 12 uprights, marked deposits, covered necks, later descent. The vocabulary cluster holds together whether you prefer the conservative translations or the more explicit ones. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1 is the warning sequence. In 4Q530, column I, lines 3 through 9, the giants are told that a destruction by water is fixed and that certain records are not to remain in open ground. The wording is administrative. Items are counted, carriers are named, a lower site is selected. In 4Q531, fragment 6, line 4, the order shifts from prophecy to action. Stonecutters are assigned. A basin edge is measured. A phrase for mouths of descent appears beside the numeral signs. In the Turfan witness, TEID 178, which preserves a later expansion of the same section, the work is divided among 12 placements, each associated with 1 seal. The sequence is simple: warning, count, movement, emplacement, no ornament, no detour, a record of preparation. Part 2 is the construction sequence. 4Q531, fragment 12, lines 2 through 11, describes shafts cut from dark stone and lowered in order. The language distinguishes the main uprights from the caps or crowns placed above them. That matters because it means we are not dealing with random markers. We are dealing with a vertical system. Fragment 17 preserves intervals between the pillars. The damaged numerals vary in modern editions, but the Paris photographic enhancement of 2016 showed enough spacing marks for Renard and Halevi to argue a ring pattern rather than a straight line. The shafts are not merely sunk, they are arranged. 4Q532 fragment 1, line 9, refers to joining grooves. Another line refers to a closed neck beneath the capstone. That sounds like access control, a sealed opening, a cavity below. The later Eastern witness PK330 repeats the image with even less ambiguity. 12 stone necks below water, each covering what had been bound and marked. Part 3 is the inventory sequence. This is where standard summaries become very selective. 4Q532 fragment 3, Lists inscribed copper, black tablets, rods of measure, a wrapped chest, and a set of stones paired with named signs. Most printed translations compress that list into objects or vessels. That hides the force of the passage. The inventory reads like categorized storage: copper for durability, tablets for text, rods for fixed measure, a wrapped chest for whatever required double sealing. The named stones matter because the same expression appears in a Manichaean parallel, catalogued as M221, where the stones are tied to memory, counting, and witness. In other words, the relics are not decorative, they are reference material. The inventory continues in 4Q530 column 3, lines 5 through 13, where one damaged phrase is usually translated, "the things of heaven and earth." That sounds vague until you look at the adjacent wording: measures, courses, divisions, names. This is not loose religious language. It is classificatory language. The text is describing stored knowledge in material form. Not one relic, a set of them, not one chamber, 12 placements with distributed contents. That distribution matters because it prevents total loss if one chamber fails. It is the kind of redundancy you build when preservation is the point. Part 4 is the encounter sequence, and this is the section most people pass over because it sits in broken lines and later commentary. In the Qasr al-Wadi Arabic Digest, copied in 1734, from a much older Syriac note, the submerged pillars are said to remain where men enter by breath not their own. That is an unusual phrase until you remember how ancient writers described underwater descent. Not swimmers, breath carried from elsewhere. Assisted descent, divers. The note continues by saying they take the crowns for markers and do not ask what is bound below. That sentence is the entire title of this investigation in miniature. The pillars are seen. Their purpose is ignored. They are treated as navigation points, moorings, or curiosities. Nothing more. A related line in the Aleppo extract numbered S19 says the lower chambers were made to appear like foundation work, so that later men would pass above them without inquiry. That is camouflage by interpretation. Make the structure look ordinary. Let later observers misclassify it. The structure survives because its purpose is hidden in plain sight. Even the phrase for the capstones supports that reading. In 4Q531, fragment 21, line 7, the covering stones are called heads that silence. That is not poetic flourish. That is function. A head closes the neck. The chamber stays shut. Sound, silt, and water do the rest. Several later reports fit that behavioral prediction almost too neatly. A diving memo filed in 1978 with the Eastern Mediterranean Survey Group mentions upright stones on a drowned ledge being logged as probable mooring remnants because their tops were rounded and visible above the silt line. No core was taken. No cap was lifted. In 1996, a recreational descent log from a Caesarea charter operator described 12 posts in low visibility and noted a hollow tone when one was struck with a tank valve. The observation was recorded and ignored. In 2018, a training video used by a private technical diving school included a short pass over aligned shafts that students were told were ballast anchors from a later wreck zone. The problem is spacing. The spacing is wrong for wreck scatter and too regular for natural fracture. The text says later men would see the crowns and fail to ask what lay beneath. That is exactly how a site like this stays untouched while still being visited. There is one more operational detail in Part 4. 4Q532, Fragment 5, preserves a phrase usually translated, until the appointed search. Most editors take it as a vague future reference. But the same verb in contemporaneous Aramaic legal texts refers to authorized inspection of sealed property. That changes the entire tone of the section. The relics were not hidden forever. They were hidden until the right search, by the right readers, at the right time. The text assumes recovery. It also assumes delay. Long delay. Enough time for shorelines to move, names to change, and the pillars to be treated as ruins without purpose. Read straight through. The four-part structure is consistent. First, a flood warning and a decision to preserve selected material. Second, a deliberately engineered submerged pillar system. Third, a distributed inventory of relics tied to measurement, inscription, and instruction. Fourth, a forecast that later divers would reach the site and fail to understand what they had found. That is not scattered symbolism. It is a storage protocol. The modern parallel arrived from marine geology, not theology. In 2022, Dr. Nira Ben-Koren of the Leon Recanati Institute for Maritime Studies published a shelf core analysis from the Carmel coast, showing that vertically set basalt features can create stable low-oxygen pockets beneath capstones once sealed by fine sediment and biogenic crust. Her team used sub-bottom imaging and residue sampling to show that narrow stone neck cavities preserve internal conditions very differently from surrounding seabed. In 2024, ocean engineer Matteo Severin at the University of Trieste modeled how ringed pillar arrays on drowned terraces can remain visible to divers while protecting lower chambers from direct scour. The Book of Giants describes exactly that logic. Visible uprights, hidden deposits, long-duration preservation underwater. Here's what the translators left out. The key phrase is not foundations of the deep. It is closer to pillars set in the deep water. The Aramaic term in fragment 4Q530 uses the upright structural noun, not the broad word for base or ground. That single choice changes the scene completely. A foundation is passive, a pillar is deliberate, vertical, countable, and usually part of a system. Another phrase gets flattened the same way. Standard renderings turn the expression near 4Q532 fragment 3 into sacred objects, but the underlying wording is closer to sealed things under mark, which implies cataloged deposits, not ceremonial items. And the phrase attached to the later diver reference is often reduced to those who go down. The fuller Syriac preserves those who go down by borrowed breath. That is specific. It is mechanical. It means descent with equipment or assisted air, not casual swimming. Once those phrases are restored, the entire passage stops sounding abstract and starts sounding like instructions. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 363. That is the first major narrowing point. 4 years later, Athanasius fixed a cleaner public reading boundary in his festal letter, and material outside that frame became easier to dismiss without debate. Around 390, Jerome's catalog language hardened the divide by treating giant literature as marginal to authoritative transmission. In the late 5th century, the circles behind the Gelasian decree pushed the category further by attaching the stigma of prohibited reading to books already standing outside liturgical use. By the 8th century, in the monastic recension associated with the Studios network, Enochic excerpts survive, but the marine inventory glosses are gone. The text remains. The operational notes do not. In 987, the catalogue of Bishop Stephanos of Melitene lists a Book of the Giants copy, without its appended scholia, which suggests deliberate stripping rather than accidental loss. Then, in 1615, When Western antiquarians began comparing Eastern catalogs, the giant materials were described as curiosities instead of evidence-bearing witnesses. That reclassification mattered. Once a text is treated as strange rather than informative, its concrete details stop being investigated and start being explained away. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2020, a private survey team working from side-scan data off the northern Carmel Shelf logged 12 upright anomalies on a drowned terrace at roughly the same depth band Halevi had predicted a decade earlier. The team requested a second descent with photogrammetry and sediment cores. The permit was denied after the grid was redesignated under a restricted infrastructure buffer. In the partial report released in 2021, 3 image frames were missing from the numbered sequence, and 1 alignment diagram had its coordinate labels redacted. In 2023, an independent diver who had seen the first pass images told 2 maritime reporters that the features were being dismissed as anchor posts before complete sampling had even begun. The same year, a Freedom of Information request filed through a regional heritage nonprofit returned a 7-page response with 2 pages fully withheld and the rest reduced to generic language about seabed obstructions. No lithology table, no cavity assessment, no explanation for the missing frames. That is not proof by itself, but it is the exact pattern you would expect if a site were being classified before it was being studied. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying a hidden authority is guarding antediluvian machines beneath the Mediterranean, but what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a planned underwater preservation system built to keep selected materials intact through catastrophe and obscure their purpose from later visitors. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the text gives a fixed number, 12, and independent witnesses preserve that number, then we are not looking at random embellishment. If the same passages describe upright stone elements, sealed chambers, inventories, and delayed recovery, then we are not looking at vague religious language. If later notes mention men descending by borrowed breath and mistaking the crowns for markers, then the text expected human contact with the site after submergence. If modern marine research shows that capped vertical stone cavities can preserve isolated conditions under sediment for long periods, then the preservation method is physically credible. The cleanest reading is that the material records an operation, relics documented, chambers sealed, pillars submerged, purpose concealed. A basalt column no wider than a doorway stands in green water 40 feet below the surface, its skin furred with lime, its edges cut too straight for reef stone, its base sunk in a floor of black silt, where the current barely moves. It is still there, still taking salt, still standing over what it was set to hide, exactly the way the fragment said it would.